Is your phone ending 66?
No. Acha, don't change that.
No, I'm not changing.
So I think I'm there. So
Okay, now let's wait for others. Is it working? Perfect. Now let's just wait for some time for people to come, after which we start with the workshop. I'll try and keep it restricted to about 1 hour to 1 hour 30 minutes. But okay, so I'll keep it restricted to 1 hour to 1 hour 30 minutes, but it might exceed that, but let's hope that doesn't happen. Yeah. Cool. So use the chat now for asking questions. I'll also allot you some like specific amount of time for asking questions, and in that case, uh, yeah, so I'll view the chats during that period. Okay. So first, I apologize for the delay because there were some technical difficulties at my end, some problems with YouTube Studio. Anyway, now I think we are online and we have a decent number of people attending. At the same time, this video will also be recorded for future reference, and it's publicly accessible, so you can just share the link with anyone, or anyone searching IIT DevSoc will be able to access the link. Mm, just one sec before. Okay. Oh no, I think now it's not buffering, so it's probably a net connection. Okay. Okay. So let's get started with the IR workshop. Okay. Okay, fine. So we have sufficient number of people. So first, the purpose behind holding a workshop of this sort, and why is international relations a very important topic in debating? In many instances, you will come across these kinds of motions very often in post-break rounds. A lot of people often seem uninterested in this particular topic, often because it requires a lot of knowledge and the way it's implemented. A lot of people also find this mundane in particular, and understandably so. And that's the reason why a lot of people get disenchanted with international relations in particular. What I'll try to do in this workshop is provide you with some basic contextualization, which will help you to at least start off with debating IR motions. But I'll also encourage you to keep reading these topics, because a lot of people face a problem in understanding or reading about international relations or news related to that. Generally, because a lot of every piece of news related to international politics generally has like a lot of background context associated with it. And when you don't have the background context, it's very easy for you to lose track of what's really happening in the article. And so people often get disenchanted with international relations. Another reason why people often tend to dislike it is because it's very mundane. So we'll be arguing a lot of logistics, you'll be arguing implementation, and there are very few principles at large in the international relations. There are principles, but they are relatively fewer in number, as a result of which a lot of people, debaters in particular, who are fond of principles tend to dislike international relations. So what I'll try to do is, one, provide some basic contextualization on what is required in IR debating. Second, I'll try and impart some basic amount of knowledge on what is really happening today and some historical context of it. And if time permits, I will try and talk about argumentation in international relations and how you should be framing arguments once you have some initial context for it. Okay, so let's get started. So I'll break this workshop into two parts. The first is, and broadly talking about IR debating as well. The first part of this workshop will be about the knowledge base which international relations generally tend to require. And the second part of this workshop will be about using that knowledge base to frame arguments and how do you really approach an IR motion? Although the first part is broadly what will cover most of the workshop. In that, what we'll see is first, we'll look at what do we really mean by international relations and what really drives relations between two different countries. Second, we'll look at some basic theories concerning international relations. Then we'll look at some of the most predominant nations that exist. Fourth, we will look at like not predominant nation, but rather like the most dominating nations and the most economically or geopolitically significant countries. Then we look at some international organizations, which are examples of how different nations interact with one another. And after this context, if we have some time, we'll look at how argumentation really happens in international relations. So let's get started with the first part of it. And between each section, I'll try and give time for all of you to ask questions and just ask me questions during that period. So that will keep things a lot more structured. With this note, let's just get started with the basics of international relations and why it's significant. First, what do we mean by IR? Is just the way different countries engage with each other, which means that the engagement could be either in the form of some form of a military engagement, or it could be political engagement, or it could be cultural, economic, or ideological. It could be a form of conflict, or it could be a form of alliance. Conflict like US China trade wars, alliances like the European Union or the NATO. Uh, each of these are a form or an example of an international relation or a subject under international relation. So, the knowledge provided in this workshop will be very basic, the extent to which my knowledge really is, and it will be enough to at least get started with debating, beyond which it will always require some degree of further reading or and further reading and further information, all of which I'll try and share once the workshop is over. So what really determines a country's relationship with other countries? So there are broadly 5 to 6 different factors behind it. The relations can be defined in terms of economic relations, which means trade agreements, trade partnerships, trade deals. It could also be allowing businesses to travel in, subsidies given to other businesses, special economic zones for foreign countries. So all of these are examples of or like countries investing in foreign countries. So all of these are examples of economic relationship. Then you have military relationships between different countries. So, for example, Russia and Iran collaborating with each other to support the Syrian government is an example of a militaristic alliance. A political alliance or a diplomatic alliance can be in the form of various political blocks which are created, right? For example, the political union aspect of European Union is one instance of such an alliance. Second example for this could be uh, the SARC, South Asian like South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. So that's another example in Asia, Southeast Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. So that becomes an example of an Asian political alliance, political plus economic alliance. So that's an example of something which is more political, whereas NATO is an example of something a lot more military. Third that we have in this, or rather fourth, is cultural. So for example, China's Belt and Road Initiative has an aspect of cultural mixing between two different countries as well. Similarly, we have foreign exchanges in countries like India where students go abroad to understand cultures of other countries, but also we have various cultural missions which are sent from one country to another, or events organized by embassies. And finally, you have ideological relationships, which means countries with similar political ideology tend to support each other. For instance, you have the Mexican president, uh, Lopez Obrador, who tries to help the Venezuelan dictator because both of them are fairly socialist, populist, and socialist in nature. So I think all of these are examples of the ways in which different countries have a tendency to interact and to pan out. Or I just want to know if you have any questions related to this basic intro part of international relations. So I'll just wait for a minute or so. So if you have any questions, just post it in the comments. Okay. So the one question is, how are cultural and ideological relationships different? Cultural relationships are often driven by things like religion. It could be driven by things like shared history. These are often entrenched in the people, and these are not politic or necessarily political in nature. So, for example, in which case these organizations are driven together by a common culture, which is their religion. Ideological alliances, on the other hand, are different. The example of that is the Warsaw Pact, where all the communist countries associated with one another. So, an ideology is generally a political ideology or some form of political leaning. So, cultural and ideological are fundamentally different because one is political ideology, a kind of viewpoint of how government should really treat its people, versus how it, and versus like how exactly do you versus like fairly shared common identity, etc. So that's more cultural. Which category would you place the G4 under? So G4 will most probably go into multiple categories, but primarily it's economic in nature, because but generally G4 is meant to also have, like, so the purpose of G4 goes more than just having a meeting of different countries. It also creates grounds for bilateral meetings between individual countries as well. So G4, more than an alliance, is more like a summit where different countries try and resolve different issues or set vision for the world. Yeah, fair. So the main aim is to have like a permanent UNSC membership, and that is fair because it is more about like the geopolitical aspects of it. So fair, like it's a combination of multiple, like I mentioned, but it's primarily economic. But at the same time, it has other elements. For example, wanting to have a UNSC membership. Mm, okay, I don't understand this question, but you could also get to me later on, Amog. Okay. So yeah, so these are the broad reasons why countries want to associate with each other, but at the same time, you have other reasons as well. And very often, alliances are very complex with different interests existing. So yeah, okay, there's one more question I missed out on. Mm, what categories to open border? Yeah, okay, there's one more question I missed out on. Mm, what categories to open borders come under? So open borders often come under like, so people keep open borders for multiple reasons. So for example, sometimes the reasons can be purely humanitarian, in which, for example, people advocating for allowing refugees, etc., through the border. Vis-a-vis, in some cases it can be cultural, because people from your identity should be allowed through the border to you. And it could be multiple reasons essentially why you want to have an open border. In the European Union, open border is broadly for economic reasons. So you have a combination of reasons why the border needs to be open. If that answers your question, Nicholas. Fair enough. So let's just move on to the next part of the session. So there are a few theories about, so let's just start at the global level and talk about a few theories that exist about how global harmony and how global peace can be established. Yeah, so where does humanitarian aid factor in? So humanitarian aid is often given either for purely humanitarian reasons, or in some instances, it's to gain more influence over the organizations which grant the humanitarian aid, or in so for example, major contributors to uh, international organizations which tend to provide aid often gives you more influence over that organization as well. So there are multiple factors over there, and sometimes humanitarian aid is also granted so that the nations which are developing don't suffer from economic problems, which eventually leads to a refugee crisis, which you don't want. Everything under these categories. Yeah. So it's okay. I think the next parts of your questions, I'll just answer them in the later part of this workshop as well. So don't worry, those questions will be answered. So first, let's start with some very basic aspects of international relations. But before that, let's look at what really determines international order and what are the general beliefs that people have or what academics tend to have about IR. So there's something called a theory of hegemonic stability, which means that there is one nation which maintains global stability, establishes international order, or often has more negotiating power, which means they create international institutions and they have an interest in maintaining global peace to the extent that their rights are more or their rights are furthered to the largest extent and their citizens are best served. This kind of interest often ensures, according to this theory, that the hegemon acts in the global interest as well, but at the same time disproportionately helps themselves. Historically, you've had instances of nations who have done so, and doing so has led to creation of a globalized system, which, while served the hegemon the most, also helped develop the other countries and also helped the other countries catch up with the hegemon later on. And according to the theory, global stability is often driven by one hegemon ensuring that their interests are being served. Historically, when there are multiple challengers in place, okay, just one second. The period of instability is often accompanied by multiple challengers existing in place, which means that whenever a hegemon is gradually losing their power and there is a new challenger to this hegemon, the hegemonic stability tends to be threatened. So historically, there have been these phases of transition after which you again had a new hegemon who came to power. So at the start, at one point in time, you had countries like Portugal and Netherlands who had predominant influence across the globe. Later on, you had countries like Spain and Sweden, who in their respective spheres had considerable influence. So Spain under King Philip II, if I'm not mistaken, during Queen Elizabeth's time in England, and Sweden under before King Charles XII, before he launched his campaign against Russia. So all of these are instances where one nation generally ensured stability and prosperity to a specific geographical region. Then you had the United Kingdom for a while when they were colonizing the globe. And after the Second World War, you had a long period where the United States has been the predominant power and the sole superpower on the planet. because of which United States was the one who had the privilege to be able to establish international organizations, set the new world order, or establish institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Federation. All of these predominantly benefit themselves by establishing different trade routes, but they also in turn benefit the other countries because their prosperity also becomes a condition for the prosperity of the hegemon as well. So the hegemonic stability theory, according to the hegemonic stability theory, these nations or the existence of a hegemon is a prerequisite for global stability because conflicting interests often tend to uh, drive that region towards some form of a war. At the same time, competition between part of my workshop, I'll broadly talk about the major powers that exist uh, in the world and give some time to each of them to really describe what situation they are in today. After which, we'll talk about various organizations and what is the purpose of those organizations. And finally, we'll talk about how you can use these facts in an argument. So, the point of the next part of the workshop would be broadly to give context to you people for any motions that you are prepping in the future by describing the major geopolitical players that exist. Before that, are there any questions on hegemonic stability theory? So I'll wait a couple of minutes. So is China posing a threat to the US stability right now, in your opinion? Or for argument's sake, you can that for argument's sake, yes, because as the hegemon sees a threat to their global influence, or the challenger often destabilizes the current order and the natural state of the world, which is anarchic, often becomes predominant. So things like US-China trade war or conflicts between USA and USSR before that are instances where, if you go by this theory, would often exemplify uh, instability stemming from a waning global hegemon. Uh, the next question is, are there counter theories contradicting these theories? I'm not sure if there's a theory directly contradicting it, but this is just something that you can broadly observe and something that can broadly be argued. But the hegemon can create instability in some regions to further their interests. Yes, that is also true. Uh, the hegemon can create instability in some regions, but when United States did that, and I think I'll also come to why USA did that, and but for now, it was a competing power along with the Soviet Union, which was the primary cause of the instability. Uh, is this theory based on what has historically been happening? Yeah, and I'll share some resources regarding this. Does the hegemon need to be capitalistic? Or no, not necessarily. Okay, so now that we have spoken about a broad overview of like what international relations on a world scale is primarily driven by, let's just get into the basics of international relations in terms of who are the primary players in this geopolitical sphere and what kind of influence do these people hold and how do you use these things in a debate. Okay, one more question. How do we establish that a particular hegemon's time is over? Oh, to be fair, you cannot easily or readily establish that the hegemon's time is over, except through various parameters, for instance, the economic prowess of the hegemon, the political influence that they have, or and In addition to this, like how much can they influence the neighboring countries to serving in order to serve their interest, and how much are they contributing to the geopolitical sphere? If there is any specific, if there isn't any specific event like the collapse of USSR, so generally, you cannot directly establish whether a hegemon's power is waning except through various parameters. So for example, the size of the country's economy or the degree of influence that the country exerts over the world affairs, either economically or militarily or through diplomatic pressure. I think all of these are parameters through which you can really assess how powerful a hegemon really is. What are the incentives for non-capitalistic hegemon to ensure prosperity of the other countries? Oh yeah, we'll talk about that when we come to countries like China. Isn't there a recipe for disaster as the hegemon is forcing ideologies over the rest? Oh, I mean, in some instances, the answer is not necessarily a yes, but rather that it can go either ways. So, in some instances, it has helped countries liberalize. In some instances, it's a dictator who has been supported. But broadly, there has been global peace because of global peace across the sphere. Yeah. So if you look at are there examples of time periods when there wasn't a clear hegemon? I think a good example is the period before the First World War and also the period between the two world wars. Because at that time neither United States was really powerful enough or a big economy to really challenge, say, a United Kingdom. But at the same time, UK was not influential enough to really compete really outcompete very easily countries like Germany or the Central Powers. So in that world, there wasn't a clear period where there wasn't a hegemon in place. Or whether they are going to cause us more harm than good is something that we will take a look at. What about the Cold War? So yeah, you can think of Cold War as a challenge to the American hegemonic stability, especially in the later part of, especially the initial part of it when the Soviet Union appeared to be ahead in the space race, etc. Fair enough. Given that we have covered these parts, I think we should move on to the next part of the session. So let's just look at who are the major global players in geopolitics. So the countries I'm going to discuss in particular are five: the United States, China, in geopolitics. So the countries I'm going to discuss in particular are five: the United States, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. I'll also discuss European Union, but I think I'll discuss that towards the end along with other international organizations that exist. And I'll just give you a context of all the things which are happening across the globe and how these countries are broadly involved in this, along with historical context of each of these countries. So, politically, we know that it's a Western United States is the most powerful nation in the world, and some of the major global players in the world are primarily originated from the United States. For instance, the big five tech firms, powerful corporations in the world, and some of the most innovative corporations in the world as well. So United States, in many ways, to their credit, have been able to produce these. And why the reason behind that is first, because of years of capitalistic development in the United States and because of widespread globalization, a lot of major patents are awarded to certain American corporations. And because the global supply chains have different bottlenecks, which means that a few patented drugs, patented technologies, they in many ways have become irreplaceable in the world. and they are way ahead of countries like China in their importance to the global trade. And why is that? First is the infrastructure that United States has. It could be the infrastructure in various like for is it resolved now? Okay, great. I'll check. Yeah, is this resolved? Okay, perfect. Fair enough. So first, let's talk about the United States and why it's. So let me just repeat the part around the United States and why it's so important in this context. So I'll just repeat the section concerning global players and why they are dominant in the world. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about broadly five global hegemons: the United States, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. That as well, so no point repeating that. So, in the United States, how important it is in the global sphere. In it's of course it's a Western democracy. Internet connection is fucked again. Huh, still buffering. Chill, I'll wait for some time while the buffering stops. Okay, perfect. So let's start with the United States and why USA is so important to global politics. First, of course, it's a Western liberal democracy. It's a capitalistic system, and there are two parties, Democrats and Republicans. The reason why USA is so central is because of the context under which USA developed in the past. When the entire world was shattered because of the World War, USA played a central role in establishing global peace. Uh, because when Europe was devastated, United States started something called the Marshall Plan, under which billions of dollars was sent to the European Union, like Europe at that time, for reconstruction purposes. Second, they formed the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to help aid other countries. Third, because United States was a leading superpower during that period, a lot of corporations and a lot of technologies were invented in the United States, and those technologies today are irreplaceable in the global supply chain. And the companies who have patented those technologies enjoy unprecedented power across the globe. These countries are central in keeping the United States powerful, but also economically extremely important. And these global supply chains means that either the United States is a producer of some important part of the global economy which nobody else can produce and requires heavy investment in technology. For example, certain drugs, certain chips, and certain different kinds of internet cables that exist across the globe. This irreplaceability of the United States in the global supply chain has enabled the United States to become the superpower that it is today, because a number of countries are dependent on it directly or indirectly. So either the USA imports a lot of things from other countries to feed into its industries, which makes export dependent countries economically reliant on the United States. Countries like Mexico which is why when United States imposed a tariff on Mexico, the same night the Mexican delegation rushed to meet Donald Trump because it was an important trade to continue for Mexico. So I think that illustrates how powerful the United States is and the American companies are. So when the United States wanted to isolate Iran, United States simply sanctioned all the businesses that conducted any form of business with Iran. And because these businesses are so many in number and so important in their scale, so important in their economic outreach, that United States was able to easily influence other countries and prevent them from really dealing with Iran in that context. What we have seen happen recently is that all of this infrastructure and all of this centrality to the economy, which they were able to build during this period, is something that Trump has been able to weaponize in order to achieve whatever they want. And I think that is not something new in the world because trade wars do happen, but it is an example of weaponizing the importance of the United States in this context. As such, what is important to note over here is that these infrastructures aren't something which can be replaced overnight. And these companies, which are dependent on USA either as a market or for legal reasons or because you're based in that country, uh, okay, I'll come to that later. So, yeah, all of these countries means that the United States was fairly central in this. So while the Iran nuclear deal was signed by Obama, it was easy for Trump to impose sanctions on Iran by stopping all the companies from performing transactions in the United States. Uh, this being said, China, even if it were to replace all the infrastructure that it itself is very dependent on from the United States, it would still take another 10 years, and then it still seems unlikely. So, what we know from an analysis by The Economist is that the USA is not going to be replaced as a superpower anytime in the future because of how important it has made itself during this period to the global economy and how interlinked all the companies are. So, a large number of Indian companies will have to cut down on jobs if there's a crisis happening in the USA tomorrow. And that's not just true for India, but across the globe. And for this reason, USA is important. But let's talk about the American military now. The US military their military budget is larger than the next four countries combined and is at $600 billion. It is at a that which is like a wide margin ahead of Russia, which is the second largest investor in military in dollars, which is $60 billion. They have military bases across the world and they have been involved in major geopolitical conflicts throughout history. Examples of these conflicts include Korea, the Korean Civil War, the Vietnamese Civil War, uh, the coup d'etat in Chile, where they overthrew a socialist leader and installed Augusto Pinochet. Uh, Another example is Iran, where democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown in a military coup which was backed by the CIA to install Shah Reza Pahlavi. So all these are examples where US either militarily or covertly were involved in some form of global conflict. The primary reason behind these conflicts can be many. In the context of these ones, which I just mentioned, the main objective was something called the containment, which was to prevent communism from spreading across the globe. Later on, the interventions were often driven either by suspicion that there is a weapon of mass destruction, as in the context of Iraq, or if they posed some form of a threat to some American ally. In each of these cases, the United States has either militarily or otherwise technologically or through in training or try to involve themselves in different global conflicts. They also contribute significantly to peacekeeping forces and conduct what are called freedom of navigation operations. The purpose of a freedom of navigation operation is to ensure that the seas are or oceans are not directly hegemonized by any country, but that all countries are allowed to go there. So the military prowess of the United States is is better than all the other countries by a wide margin, and their technologies have. For example, they were able to very easily. They have historically been able to track down Baghdadi. They kept Qasim Soleimani, and they were able to track him. They were able to track down Osama bin Laden. All of which are instances of uh, all of the which are result of substantial investment in technological advancement, which helped the United States to get there, has varied across history. So broadly, there are many stances that USA has taken about how they should interact with the outside world, but I'll just discuss three or four of them over here. Before the First World War and also after the First World War, USA followed a policy called isolationism. Isolationism implies that United States, or rather the politicians, okay, there's another buffering issue happening. Is it better now? Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so across the globe was broadly, well, of course, it differed over time, but at the same time, we can divide them into different types. But of course, like it varies with every president, it varies with the same president from time to time. The first is called isolationism. Isolationism implied that the United States should refrain from any form of interference in global conflicts, partly because you don't want America to be involved in something which is destructive, partly because you don't want your armies to be conscripted, uh, but also because it hurts your economy when you're a part of all of this. And